Good morning and welcome to our introduction to the book of Job as we continue our Bible through the year. Job is probably one of the familiar stories in the Bible. It's quite long, it's longer than you think it is, but it's one of the stories in the Bible where if I was to say to you, give me a summary of what happens in the book of Job, you could probably give me a passing summary of it. And broadly speaking, it's split into different parts of the story. We begin in the first couple of chapters with what is an incredibly problematic scene in heaven, where you have this conversation between the accuser, and I choose that word very carefully, that name very carefully, and I'll come on to that in a moment, and God in heaven. Now, we have a theology of evil. We have a theology of the dark side, based on a lot of medieval kind of theology and a little bit of mythology thrown in there as well. We need to be careful with the Bible that we don't assume that certain things are the same when we talk about the devil or Satan or evil or so on. So the phrase that's used in Job is the accuser, ha Satan, ha being the word the, so it's not a name, it's a function, the accuser. Now, most people believe that that's the same name as we're then talking about in the New Testament, the devil. So in the New Testament, we have the phrase the devil, but we don't really have that in the Old Testament. We have the accuser, and so this pops up, this figure pops up time and time again in the Old Testament. So we say Satan as a name. It's not a name in the Bible, it's a function. It might be a function that's taken on by the devil, but it is a function. The accuser, it's actually a legal position of someone who would stand against a person who was sort of on trial. So Job, as it were, is on trial, and you then have the accuser and you have God almost as the advocate in heaven, and you have God almost boasting, to have you seen my servant Job, how wonderful he is, how great he is, and the accuser says, well, of course he's great. Of course he loves you because you've given him everything. He's got everything he'd ever wanted. So why would he have reason to doubt you or to not love you or trust you, and so on? And so God then sets these parameters through which the accuser can test Job. So you can do whatever you want to him, but you can't take his life. And then you have this succession of almost like lightning bolt strikes in which Job kind of loses everything. And if it wasn't so tragic, it would be almost kind of comical the way the story's told, because it's literally like, whilst one servant comes in and says to Job, whilst you've been here, your all your animals have died. And as he's finishing the story, another servant comes in and says, well, whilst that was happening, this has gone wrong, and whilst that's happening, this has gone wrong, and then the last servant comes in and says, all your children basically have died because the roof has collapsed on, strong wind has come and a roof has collapsed on them, and periodically, Job gets these blows, these lightning strikes where he's lost everything, and then he's sort of physically not well, and he's in sackcloth and ashes, which is the sign of mourning, and he's lost everything. And for many of you who've been through losses, real losses, you'll know just that saps the energy, saps the life, the joy out of you, and he's just there lost in his mourning and weeping, and his friends come. He's got three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar, and they come to comfort him, and they do really well to start off with. They comfort him really well, and the word that is used for the comfort, is that you're there doing it with them. So as he's weeping and mourning, they're weeping and mourning alongside with him. This sort of almost physical kind of rocking back and forth that you see in Middle Eastern cultures very often is this sort of rocking back and forth to pray. That's what they're doing. They're doing it with him. They're there with him, and they don't say anything. And to quote that great pastoral theologian, Ronan Keating, who's not a theologian at all, for those of you who don't know that Ronan Keating isn't a great theologian, he's a pop star. And he wrote a song that said, "You say it best when you say nothing at all." And in lots of ways, that's where Job's friends get it right. They're there, they're with him, they're weeping with him, they're mourning with him. They're not trying to give him advice, they're just there. And then, Job doesn't snap out of it as quickly as maybe they want. And so they go, "Oh, come on, Job, it's been a while." And, have you ever found that when you've been mourning and you feel like people think you should be getting over it quicker? Or maybe you feel, "I should be getting over it quicker." That's not the case with suffering, with loss. There is no right time, right amount of time to feel loss and to feel pain. But his friends are there with him in the best bits. They're there with him when it's hard. And then you have this several chapters where there's that dialogue between Job and his friends. You then have this dialogue between Job and God, where Job kind of throws all these questions at God. And the amazing thing is that God turns up. God shows up and doesn't answer any of Job's questions. But he has a whole bunch of questions for Job. And they're kind of semi-rhetorical questions. Where were you when I founded the world? You know everything. Surely you must be able to tell me how this happens. Did you measure out the line that the sun travels on its course across the sky? Did you tame the sea monsters and take them home as your pet? Surely you know, Job. It's that kind of line of questioning. So God turns up and God is talking about how he has everything under control. But the big picture is that God has everything under control. And yes, it's hard, and yes, it's painful, and yes, it's a struggle at times, but God has everything under control. I used the phrase Sunday recently, and I've used it before. We don't know what the future holds, but we know the one who holds the future. And that's the way we can trust him and have faith, even in those hard times, is that we know that God is holding it all together. And the real challenge for the story of Job is that God turns up, maybe not in the way that Job wanted, maybe not in the way that Job expected, but certainly God shows up, not with answers, and there are very rarely answers that satisfy in that moment of suffering. There's a great book, I'm looking to my bookshelf, and I can't see it immediately, so I can't hold it up for you, but it's a book called The Doors of the Sea, by a guy called David Hart Bentley, and it's about the Boxing Day tsunami from many years ago, 2005 I think it was, and it's talking about this little girl who has lost everything and then dies as a result of the tsunami. And the book ends by saying, at the end of time, rather than explain to this little girl why her suffering was necessary in the big scheme of things, God will rather sweep her up in his arms and wipe away every tear from her eyes. And that's the tenderness of God that we need in those moments of pain and suffering, because God doesn't often explain to us why that loved one who went too soon had to go in the grand scheme of eternity, because those answers would never really satisfy us, because we could never understand them. But God will take us up in his arms, and he will wipe away every tear from our eyes. The big thing in Job is that God turns up. But the challenge in the story of Job is, is our faith just based on when things are going well? Is our faith in God directed towards God because God has blessed us and everything's going all right? But when troubles come, when hardships come, it all falls apart. And we know people, maybe we've heard of people, or we actually know people for whom that's the case, where their faith seems kind of stable, but when everything kind of falls apart, so does their faith, and actually it wasn't really grounded on anything other than this kind of prosperity gospel mindset that, God has blessed me, therefore God is good. Well, what happens when it feels like God isn't blessing you? Or maybe even that God has caused things to happen in your life that, are the opposite of that. How is your faith then? How does it stand up? And the big questions of, from the first 2 chapters about this scene in heaven between God and the accuser. Does God allow suffering? Does God cause suffering? They are big questions that loom up there that don't really get answered in the book. So there is a huge book in terms of its theology, and we can explore that together some other time. But it'll be an interesting read, and particularly the conversation towards the last third of the book between God and Job, and then how the story ends with the restoration of Job getting back what had been lost to some degree. So I pray that it might be a blessing to you. It might be a hard one for you, but may in your times of suffering, you be able to say with Job in the book, I know that my advocate waits on high, and may you know him with you and showing up for you as you explore this further. God bless you.